For our next conversation, I want to engage my guest on the critical issue of grassroots empowerment and inclusivity, targeting women and the youth. This conversation is not only important, but noble, considering that the quality of governance at the subnational level, where citizens interface mostly and, the most directly with the state, is the primary determinant of national stability, or some will say so. And so the empowerment of the youth and women is not a charitable venture, but rather it's considered a strategic imperative for economic transformation. But let me bring in my guest just so he paints a clearer picture and gives us better insight on this issue. He is Hamza Aliu, Executive Director, Initiative for Grassroots Advancement, INGRA. Hamza is our regular, is our own in-house consultant for matters like this. Hamza, thank you so much for coming through, as usual, of course. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you, Nnamdi, for having me always. It's good to always be here.
Fantastic. I came across some data recently while, in my research for our conversation on women and youth empowerment in Nigeria, and that's regarding the level of impact now. That data appears to show that women's economic empowerment yields about 90% reinvestment rate, but more particularly into family welfare, and that youth empowerment does almost as good as that, nearly as impactful as women as well. But yet we see states draw up budgets, and we see women and youth empowerment appearing as a symbolic line item in their budget and not as a strategic allocation in this budget. From your experience, Hamza, what would it take to reframe subnational budgets so that empowerment for women and youth, are treated as serious business, just as serious as infrastructure or other key infrastructures? But now that we also, make these investments or allocations with measurable, accountable outcomes in terms of impact for women and the youth. How can we reframe that conversation?
Thank you, Nnamdi, for that question. Actually, I was on the lighter mood. I was hoping that you were going to also speak about the investment in the budget for men, but you didn't go there. I was hoping you were going to go there. You didn't go there. But so let's continue. Let's continue. Yes, maybe that's another conversation for another day.
For another time.
You mentioned investment in women and youth, and if I was going to use a phrase for it, I'd say return on investment is very high. That 90% should be return on investment in terms of the quantum of investment we make on women and youth finds its way into the family 90% of the time. Now, that is a very huge data to have in terms of any entrepreneur that wants to go into that kind of business. If you want to build families, which is the smallest unit of every society, if you want to build a family, then invest in women and youth. So it's strange that this question is coming up, because you will assume that logically we would be investing in women and children if we want to get that 90% return on investment for our families. But we don't do it. Why don't we do it? Now, that is the million-dollar question. We have always known that the issues around our socio-cultural environment makes it difficult for women and children and young persons to find their way to leadership positions. Remember, politics is who gets what and when. So for you to be able to forward or allocate resources for women and children and young persons, you should be at that table where the resources are being allocated. And you should be, they say, he who has the knife and the yam will determine how he's going to slice it. And so in terms of that political environment where these decisions are made, we don't see women and children. We don't see women and young persons there. If you look at our statistics in terms of how many women are represented in our political leadership, that is abysmal. If you look at the National Assembly, if you look at in terms of appointments, if you look at in terms of the governors, how many of them are women? In terms of local government chairmen, how many of them are women? In terms of houses of assemblies, how many of them are women? You find that there are a lot of gaps in that. So participation in leadership is one of the key reasons why we don't have that kind of investment coming in. But unfortunately, even the young persons even the men that are present in that fair where the decisions are made don't seem to fare much, because I don't know whether they allocate any monies to themselves. But one key thing that's important is that the political visibility, the political participation, leadership participation of women and young persons is the reason why they don't have that kind of investment. And until we get that right, you will find that we are going to be struggling. And that's why you see when we allocate budgets to issues around women and young persons, what you see these days is that when you say young persons, it's sports and Ministry of Youth and Sports, you hear. You'll be asking anything about youth, why does it have to be sports? Why can't it be Ministry of Youth and Technology? Why can't it be Ministry of Youth and Health? Why can't it be Ministry of Youth and Education? How come it's Ministry of Youth and Sports? And then you hear Ministry of Women Affairs and Social Development. Why? Because they want to add children to it. So we have a lot of to identify clearly where we need to where we need to put the most investment if we want to help our families, we want to help our society. Unless we do that, we'll have this problem.
So do you think the governance structure is the problem? Because, I mean, we'll talk about this inclusion or exclusion of women and children and how it creates, you know, a democratic legitimacy crisis. And I'm sure you have witnessed up close where state governments, prioritize patronage over social infrastructure. So when I talked about governance structure system earlier on, I meant, do you think constitutionally or say politically, the governance system has done enough to reverse this structure that we have talked about of exclusion that relegates young persons, the youth and women, to political mobilizers rather than decision makers themselves? And in talking about changing the narrative, how do we begin to change this structure at maybe local government level or, the state as it is?
Well, the question is not, our constitution is not a problem. Our governance is derived from our constitution. Our constitution is actually gender neutral. It is age neutral. So the only time the constitution mentions age is when you want to vote, that you must be 18 to be able to vote. So that is the point at which you are an adult. So it doesn't. You can be a woman, you can be a man, you can be a boy, girl, as long as you're 18. That so the question will now be, how come our constitution that is neutral produces a system that disenfranchises women and young persons to the extent that it's beginning to tell on our development? Well, our governance is a reflection of our society. Our society is what governs us as a people. And that society is governed by culture and religion. We're very cultural. We're very religious. And our culture is predominantly a patriarchal culture where men take dominance. And so it becomes difficult if you want to, since democracy is a participation game, if you want to participate in governance, then you must look at how does the culture allow those who should participate, and what are the cultural norms and systems that allows everybody to participate. You see that participation for women and young persons is determinant on the predominant male in that environment. If it's a family, it's the man that takes the decision. So because of that, you find that it's difficult for the system, the governance system, to throw up women and young persons into governance, because you need to have those gatekeepers agree with you. So if we're going to change it, we need to either do one of two things. Either we change our constitution to reflect our society, or we change our society to reflect our constitution. Either way, we must find a balance between the two of them. And the reason why we're having this back and front is that we don't have a balance yet. Nobody is sitting down to say, come, all this participation we're talking about, are we looking at where we're coming from? Do we need to change something where we're coming from so it will suit what we want to be, what we want to do? Right now, we are forcing a round peg in a square hole, and we think it's going to fit. It's not fitting. And the results are showing clearly that we have a large percentage of our population not active in governance, and they are not being funded for in our budgetary system. Public institutions are built without them in that sphere of decision making, or without them participating in developing that particular institution you want to do for them. So I think it is not our system. It is who we are. We have to identify and agree on who we are. That will help us develop the kind of system that will help us move the way we want to move.
I want to agree with you that we need to reach or create, that balance where society evolves to meet and, and reflect its constitution as well. And there are aspects to this conversation, Amza. And one of the aspects is also the quality of leadership, where you talked about leadership being a reflection of society. And I'd like to take you along that lines and ask you perhaps what's your opinion is on the quality of leadership in Nigeria. And I mean politically, and particularly at the sub-national level now, where we have, we see things happening in states. I just recently, a couple of days ago, I happened across a seminar paper on this subject matter of empowerment, of women and youth in states and local government. And what that paper essentially describes, is Nigeria at a stagnated level. It says Nigeria's stagnation, there's a confusion between leadership and, and what makes up, or the qualities that makes up leadership, as it were. That's what the paper focused on. But can we look at leadership in terms of, how it incorporates issue of character, how it incorporates issues of will, and strengthening institutional character again, as against rulership. And in terms of rulership, in terms of pushing, pushing leadership or pushing governance along the lines of patronage and short-term gains. And we see this play out, and I say this because we see this play out oftentimes, maybe, but more particularly at the state level, at these subnational levels, where development strategies rarely outlive the administration in power at that time, administration, on seats. How can we now force leadership, or, then force a narrative where leaders, prioritize institutional continuity over the impulse to dismantle or rebuild for what they term political convenience? How do we get to that stage where governance or governance structure is at a level where there's continuity in policies rather than discontinuing policies because of convenience or for the sake of convenience?
Well, I think that question comes back to, I hate sounding like a broken record. It comes back to the fact that we are using half of our population, we are engaging half of our population when it comes to political governance. The data speaks for itself. Less than 10% of our elected leaders are women. Less than 10 to 15% are youth. So it means that more than 65% of those persons that will show up as leaders, both at subnational level and at national level, is even worse at subnational level, because at subnational level, culture and religion plays a more stronger role when it comes to who becomes a leader. And so you see that a lot of times, the number of women and young persons that we have at the national level seems to be better off than what we have at the state level and local government level, because you cannot be a leader in your community when the men are the one making decisions. You can't be a leader in your community when the older persons are the ones that are taking decisions. Because what we're talking about now is power play. Who holds the stakes? Who holds the cards? In leadership, influence is about power. And when it comes to allocation of resources, influence counts more. Power counts more. And so a man that has power cannot understand where a woman who has never tested power is coming from. And so when they want to do a policy, when they want to do, they want to give, House of Assembly members want to give something to their communities. Instead, they will go and they will think, oh, this is what the women need. They will not ask the women, what do you need? And because of that, they will go give you hoe and cutlass instead of giving you probably a hairdressing machine for you to use, because that's what you feel like doing. But the man sits down and says, I think because my wife is only talking about a cutlass and going to farm, you too need a cutlass and farm. So it is about influence. And unless we get the people who are
when you
directly
say it
involved.
that way, I tend to agree with you. In fact, but seriously, in fact, there are empirical research or reports out there that supports this claim, or that supports this position that you've just made. Certain reports indicate that, for instance, that women legislators are more prone, or they often push for infrastructure that promotes access to resources like water, health, and education.
Yes.
And that when you flip it to young persons or young legislators, they often canvass for development issues like digital literacy, like you talked about technology earlier, and long-term horizons. But what we see and continue to see in many states is that women are often confined, where they exist or where they are within the polity and in the systems, they are confined to soft ministries. And the young people, youth, are entirely absent from cabinet level executive portfolios. Yes, we see some of them now, even at federal level, at state levels, but it's rare and it's not a given. What do you think the political strategy should be to move beyond just increasing numbers now? We need 10 more women, we need 20 more women, but moving inclusivity from mere presence to power, and this power that you're talking about, power and influence that you're talking about, and ensuring that their perspectives, actually shape policies at that level where it matters, at the executive levels, inside the state executive council meetings, where it matters the most.
Yeah, Nnamdi, one key tool that we have found that is universally acceptable and it helps in bridging this gap that we're seeing is that affirmative action tool. Right now, Nigeria has a gender policy that says 35% affirmative action for women, meaning that in both appointive and elective positions, we should have at least, out of every 10, we should have between 3 and 4 women being in giving those positions of leadership. But what we see in reality is that it is a policy, and because it is not a law, many implementers, those politicians, will tell you, well, in our place, that kind of policy doesn't work. You hear subnational states will say, well, we don't have that policy in my state. And so it's going to be at the behest or at the leisure of, or at the magnanimity of the leader or whoever is governing the place to now say, okay, we're going to allocate some slots to you. Almost like they're doing you a favor, what we call tokenism.
Yes,
because
tokenism.
of that, since we don't have structural legal frameworks that will help us to say, in the next 30 years, we want to ensure that 35% of our leadership are young persons and another 35% are women. Now, that is a strategic outlook and what a forward-looking governance should look like. And then you begin to say, how do we implement this policy? Do we begin to pass legislative action at the state levels, at the local government levels to say, we need to implement this? As we are currently, even the federal government is not implementing its own 35%. So how do you want a governor to implement his own? Or a local government chairman? So we still have that issue around women should be heard, not seen. It's still there. Men still ask that question. You're a woman now. What are you doing here? This small boy. We had of recent, we are hearing that a party is saying, this small boy, what is he going to do here when we have older men? So you can see that mindset. We still have it playing out in our society. And unless we begin to strategically sit down and begin to articulate how we want to see involvement of young persons and women in our governance level, we're still going to be having this tokenism that we're looking. If you look at our budget, it's so poor. It's really, really poor when it comes to issues around that affect women, like you said, water, health, education. These are things that matter to women. Purchasing power, markets, food. Those things matter to women because they are about family. And so if you left a woman alone as a governor or as a president, she will prioritize these issues more than security, more than going to space, more than ESTA codes that we see the men doing. women will prioritize issues that affect their families more than men will do. Young persons will prioritize, like you say, digital literacy. They will prioritize issues around financial inclusion. All these things are what makes a developing country move forward. But alas, we're still struggling with the bread and butter issues around who are we? How do we define ourselves? We are still defining ourselves by whether we're a man, a woman, a young person, or an old person, rather than
Yes.
what capacity can we bring to the table. So I think the
I'm sorry.
conversation needs to get.
Yes. Yes. I was just going to say, sorry for butting in there, but I was just going to say this is right up your alley. This is, I reckon, the initiative for grassroots advancement, does programs to, throw this whole issue there on the table. And I wonder how some of what you do as civil society to push this conversation right to the doorstep of government and ensure that they practice some of what you've just talked about there. Because honestly, and I think the point's been made already, that women and young persons or youth need to be co-developers, like we owners of the development planning and budget oversight, functions, and not just be mere spectators. And when it comes to issues like this. On a final note, just so we round off our conversation, because I understand that this is about it for this section or episode of for this segment of the program. That is, just so in 60 seconds, if it's possible, local government. When we talk about empowerment of women and youth, do you think they still stand as it is right now, considering the situation of things, whether we're talking about local government autonomy, whether it's in practice or ideally, do you think they still stand the opportunity to become laboratories to grow inclusivity for women and youth empowerment?
I would say that in terms of potential, we are on the right track. The local government is the most important tier of government that can midwife this our conceptions, this our vision, this our aspirations to include everybody in governance, because they are the closest to the people. And so I would say yes, we're on the right track because we have existing local governments. The fact that we have them in our constitution means we have the tools we need to work. Now the question will be, do we have the right people who have the right capacity and skills to be able to convert these potentials into reality for us? Now, that is the human beings that we need to begin to ask ourselves. How do we midwife? How do we incubate the necessary capacity, necessary human resources needed to convert our potentials we have at the local government level into realities for our governance structure? So it's something that our academia must come in, our political parties must come in, our community leaders must come in. You ask what we do in INGRA. What we do is we mainstream issue of gender in everything we do. When we look at budget, we say, how does it affect women? What did you budget for women? We're teaching young girls how to analyze budget. We're teaching young girls why they should register and become a political party member. Because we know that is the only way you can push this agenda into the mainstream political governance structure that we have. So we need more of such engagement, more of such strategies, of such cooking in that local palace. Bring this food together and boil it and cook it. When it done and is properly cooked, you see that we now have the needed human capacity, the needed critical mass that we want for us to move forward. It's possible. We have the potential. How we go about it, it's going to be determined by whether we actually want to make it work or not.
Hamza Aliu, Executive Director, Initiative for Grassroots Advancement, INGRA. Thank you so much for your insights, as always. It's been a pleasure having you on our program.
Thank you for having me always. It's a pleasure being here always. Thank you.